had a difficult time finding legitimate charges against him, as we find in verses 3 and 4. Can this be said of us in our work? We must also take notice of it to the praise of Darius the king, that he will prefer a man that's purely of his personal merit and his fitness for business. And those sovereigns that will be well served must go by that rule. Look for the person with merit and fitness for business, not any cronies of ours. Daniel had been a great man in the kingdom that was conquered, and for that reason, one would think should have been looked upon as an enemy and as such imprisoned or banished. He was a native of a foreign kingdom and a ruined one at that, and upon that account might have been despised as a stranger and captive. But Darius, the king, it seems, was very quick-sighted in judging of men's capacities and was soon aware that this Daniel had something extraordinary in him. Indeed, when we have Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit, we have something in us that makes us extraordinary. And therefore, though no doubt he had people of his own, not a few, that expected preferment in this newly conquered kingdom and were gaping for it. And those that had been his long time confidants would depend upon it that they should be now his president. Yes, so well did he consult the public welfare that finding Daniel to excel them all in prudence and virtue, and probably having heard of his being divinely inspired, he made him his right-hand man. Being divinely inspired and influence makes a great difference. Being divinely inspired and influenced by the Holy Spirit makes a great difference. We learn that God can use any person irrespective of age, and that age does not matter to God if one was faithful to him. So let us continue to serve faithfully where we are placed as long as there is life. You can see that during the time of this Darius, Daniel must have been somewhere 70 or 80 years of old. What a good man he was. An excellent spirit was in him, as in verse 3. And was faithful to every trust, dealt fairly between the sovereign and the subject, and took care that neither should be wrong, so that there was no error or fault to be found in him. He never made any blunder. This is recorded for an example to all that are in places of public trust, to approve themselves, both careful and conscientious, that they may be free, not only from fault, but from error, not only from crime, but from mistake. The corruption canker in our can only be cured by such attitude as Daniel had. What a world was born of him, both his greatness and for his goodness. The presidents and princes envied him because he was advanced above them, and probably hated him because he had a watchful eye upon them and took care they should not wrong the government to enrich themselves. How we wish that we had more of such Daniels in our country. Despite the envy and hatred and the schemes to kill him, they could find no occasion against him. They owned that they could not. Daniel always acted honestly, and this stood him in good stead and is worthy of emulation. Daniel's pious disobedience to this law that was schemed up in verse 10 did not retire into the country nor abscond for some time, though he knew the law was leveled against him. And we remember that in church history, during the persecution, some bishops absconded for a while. But Daniel, because he knew it was so, he stood his ground, knowing that he had now a fair opportunity of honoring God before men and showing that he preferred the favor of God and his duty to him before life itself. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he might have gone to the king and explained himself, but he did not. He might have remonstrated against it as grounded upon misinformation, that all the president had consented to it, whereas he who was the chief of them had never been consulted about it. And he went to his house and applied himself to his duty, cheerfully trusting God with the event. That we will also learn to cheerfully trust events in the hands of God. The church must stand its ground for the truth and not be silent about it. I would like also to look at the influence of prayer in Daniel's constant practice, which we were not informed of before this occasion, but which we have reason to think was the general practice of the pious Jew. One, he prayed in his house and made a solemn business of it. Cornelius was a man that prayed in his house in Acts 10:30. Okay, sorry, we were lost for a moment. Note that every house not only may be, but ought to be a house of prayer where we have a tent. God must have an altar, and on it we must offer spiritual sacrifices. In every prayer, he gave thanks. When we pray to God for the message we want, we must praise him for those we have received. Thanksgiving must be a part of every prayer. In his prayer and thanksgiving, he had an eye to God as his God. He did this before his God and with a regard to him. When he prayed and gave thanks, he knelt upon his knees, which is an appropriate gesture in prayer, expressing humility and reverence and submission to God. He opened the windows of his chamber that the sight of the invisible heavens might affect his heart with an awe of that God who dwells above the heavens. But that was not all. He opened them towards Jerusalem, the holy city, though now in ruins, to signify the affection he had for it and the remembrance he had of his concerns daily in his prayers. 3 times a day Daniel prayed, and 3 times every day, according to the example of David, morning, evening, and at noon, I will pray. Psalm 55, verse 17. This is surely as little as may be to answer the command of praying always. He did this so openly and avowedly that all who knew him knew it to be his practice, and he thus showed it, not because he was proud of it, but because he was not ashamed of it. Though Daniel was a great man, he did not think it below him to be thrice a day upon his knees before his maker and to be his own chaplain. Though he was an old man, he did not think himself past it, nor, though it had been his practice from his youth up, was he weary of his well-doing. Though he was a man of business, vast business for the service of the public, he did not think that would excuse him from the daily exercise of devotion. How inexcusable then are those who have but little to do in the world and yet will not do that much for God and their souls. Daniel was a famous man of prayer. Note, it is no new thing for that which is done faithfully in the conscience towards God to be misrepresented as done obstinately and in contempt of the civil powers, that is, for the best sins to be reproached as the worst men. And this is what happened to Daniel. And the king was sorely displeased with himself for gratifying this craft by his governors. In verse 14, note, when men indulge a proud, vainglorious humor and please themselves with that which fits it, they know not what vexations they are preparing for themselves. And in our camp, we see one mao yonku and chankroan, one so unche edu. And we can find references of Haman and Mordecai in the book of Esther, how the problems we foment, we may fall in the traps that we set, we ourselves may fall in. The violence with which the persecutors demanded this judgment was uncalled for. One cannot think of it without the utmost compassion to the gracious sufferer and the utmost indignation at the malicious persecutors. In a similar manner, when Christ was buried, his adversaries sealed the stone that was rolled to the door of his sepulchre, just as these laid upon the mouth of the den the seal of the king, as well as their own seals to ensure that Daniel will fall prey to the lions. The king wished to see Daniel alive and could not doubt God's ability to keep Daniel alive. What he doubted, if we are sure of that the servants of the living God have a master who is well able to protect them and bear them out in his service. Those who boldly and cheerfully trust in God to protect them in the way of their duty shall never be made ashamed of their confidence in him, but shall always find in him a present help. Another young man like Daniel in wisdom, when he was a young man, was a very intelligent person. He was at the top of his class in secondary school. And like Paul, had a special experience with the Lord. And I'm talking about Kwame Bediako and Tim Hartman in Theology After Colonization on Bediako back at the future of theology reflects that Kwame Bediako understood that the lasting impact of colonization on him was atheism, not Christianization. So biographies and influence of religion. There have been so many influences, and unfortunately, this continues. So they concluded that these people concluded that their only chance of finding fault with Daniel was in connection with the requirement of his religion, and hatched a plot to eliminate him. Religion has been a source of departure for many people, and men have over the years used religion in various ways to justify what they do until challenged. And Tim Hartman has said that most of the theological professors of Kaaba gave support to the military schemes of Kaiser William II until Bach opposed this with his theological insights. He notes also that Professor Kwame Bediako at one time, influenced by this same Christian belief in God, was an atheist, but after the self-revelation of Christ to him, he stuck with Christ, and this defined who he really was, a Christian and a true African. He understood that it was not Western Christianity perspectives through the missionaries and colonization that defined who a person was, but being in Christ and making him the savior and Lord of his or her life made the real difference. And he stuck to this firm belief till the end. This influenced his life and teaching, both as a pastor and an academician, and he challenged many in this direction. And when Kwame Bediako was reflecting on this experience that he had in his personal reflections on worship as vital participation in 2005, when Jesus Christ, he says, when Jesus Christ became real to me nearly 35 years ago, I discovered that I was recovering my African identity and spirituality. Kwame Bediako indicates the influence that the impressive career of others like William Wade Harris, who blazed a trail from Liberia to Western Apollonia, or the short but inspiring career of Simon Kimbangu in the Belgian Congo, now Zaire, or the charismatic ministry of Isaiah Zivembi in South Africa had on people such that the religion of Jesus of Nazareth had become a truly African religion communicated by African Christian prophets and preachers and conveyed in categories of African thinking, demonstrated to be effective by both the appeal and its challenge to African religiosity. In conclusion, Daniel's prayer life was a challenge to the people around and to the king. His wisdom stemmed from his prayer relationship with and strong faith in God. Throughout the book of Daniel, one does not fail to see Daniel as a man full of wisdom, but also of great humility. In Daniel 2:27 following, before he told the king anything else, he gave credit to God, explaining that he did not know the dream through his own wisdom, but that only because God revealed it. How easily we take credit for what God does through us. Any academic progress must be attributed to God's purpose and will to work through us to reveal more knowledge. If we give God the credit for our actions, others will want to know more about him. And this attitude, I believe, Reverend Professor Bediako displayed to a large extent his humility in spite of his academic prowess, and hence the incorporation of devotional life into academic work and life here at Akrofi-Christaller. May I end with Akrofi's Bediako's observation that the thrust of Christianity into Ashanti, especially of the Methodist Church at the time, cannot be understood apart from the achievement of an illiterate preacher, Samson Opon. The history of the Presbyterian Church in Ghana, Dambe is not fully understood without appreciation of the career of the traditional priest and leader, revered evangelist Paulo Mohenu of Abokobi. The influence of such people on life situations and circumstances portray the importance of the example of such men of faith, such as Daniel. The brief biography of Daniel, as set out in this devotion, is an example of the values that we need to emulate to portray the excellencies of God's kingdom. And this is what Jesus himself did. Had a great influence on many women in various ways. He was the champion of women's rights far back then. And this is what the Diaku says in one of his sermons to end. But if Jesus is companion of women, he so fully, not in parts only, but completely. He sees the real needs of people and deals with them. He heals and makes completely whole all round. Osa yaria ebirinka a enya onam yarisa nkuto na mmom huhumu yarisa. That is total healing of both body and spirit. Nipa kra mu yarisa any asitra ankasa mu nso yarisa. That is healing of body and life situations in general. Okwen biara nipa paso yare any okwen biara yare enso paso ese nipa any nipa ntem no yes diso ejuma. In whatever way illness comes upon man and affects relationship, Jesus has the key. The yare said dimu a ebinka. This is from Kwambe Diako on one of his sermons on women on Women's Day. And I end this by exhorting all of us to look at our biographies of great men and learn from them as we have learned from Daniel. God bless you for being part of this devotion. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for this time and pray that you will continue to speak to our hearts as we learn of great men who have influenced generations in their time and generations after. We pray that, Lord, we will also, like Daniel and many others, also be men and women whom you have so affected that our lives will influence what we do now and other people we serve. We thank you for hearing us. We have prayed in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Well, on your behalf, I would want to say thank you very much to Right Reverend Michael Bosman, the Administrative Bishop of the Methodist Church Ghana, and the PhD candidate here at ACI, who happens to be working on family. Yeah.
Director is speaking.
Thank you very, very much, Administrative Bishop. We should be beginning our next session, and therefore I would want us to move very quickly. On behalf of the Institute, I wish to warmly welcome all of you to this year's doctoral seminar. A year ago, on 15th March, the President of the Republic addressed the nation and directed that all institutions should close down. We were due to hold our doctoral seminar a week later. In the circumstances, we were forced to postpone it. There was a possibility that we might hold it later in the year. But not too long after the postponement, we came to the conclusion that we would have to defer it until this year. We are grateful to God that we have seen this year and we have this opportunity to meet for this doctoral seminar. The theme we have carried over from last year is researching biographies, the field, resources, and sources. This morning, for our first lecture on biographical research, biographical research, rudimentary steps. We have a retired assistant professor of history from the University of Ghana, Professor Robert Addo Fening, who is no stranger to ACI. He has been with us for decades now. and of course teaches on our research methods course. We are deeply grateful that he is able to be with us. If you want to know more about Professor Addo Fening, I would encourage you to get a copy of his autobiography, Abriwanana, A Trajectory of Life. Now, we have somebody then who has not only written about figures of history, especially of the Achim Ebuakwa area, that is history that Professor Addo Fening has expertise on, but someone who has also himself written about his own life. So we really are privileged to have Professor Addo Fening share with us on this theme of biographical research, documentary research. Professor Addo Fening, you are most welcome, and we are ready to listen to you.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning and to share my experiences in this field of historical writing. As you rightly pointed out, I retired from Labour, where I was for about 28 years, and then from 1999, I've been with Akrofi-Christaller as an adjunct lecturer. Now, I'd like to start my discussion with the definition of history and biography. Now, history is used first in a broad sense to refer to the entire range of events of the human past. So you can write about any activity in the past, whole range of events of the human past. Kitson-Clark defines history as anything that has ever happened in the past, however long ago or however recently. It doesn't matter when it happened. Anything that has ever happened in the past, however long ago or however recently. He extends the term to cover any attempt to describe what has happened in the past before the actual moment of narration. So as I speak now, what happened 1 hour ago is also part of history. Any attempt to describe what has happened in the past before the actual moment of narration. Now, Thurston Shaw shares the quote above in this book, broader sense. For him, history is, quote, what happened in the past, whether anyone wrote anything about it or not. Okay. That is why we hear people say, oh, yesterday history was made when so-and-so opened the new stadium in Kumasi, even though nobody has written anything about it. But still, because it has happened, it's in the past, it is historical. The second definition of history puts the emphasis on description and interpretation. It's not only right in putting your thoughts together in a chronological sequence, but it also involves interpretation. I'm sure you know about the type of history people of my generation went through. It was all this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, without any connections, without any interpretation. But history today is written as a description and also as interpretation. These elements are crucial. Professor Barraclough defined history in this sense as the attempt to discover on the basis of fragmentary evidence the significant things of the past. In other words, you are looking for the significant things in the past. And what you are using consists of fragmentary evidence, bits and pieces that you're going to put together to construct the story in a coherent way. So it says the attempt to discover on the basis of fragmentary evidence the significant things of the past. So note here that is not everything that is a subject of history. It is those things that are significant. And you discover them on the basis of fragmentary pieces of evidence, which we call sources. So history is about the past. It's an attempt to put together to a coherent story what happened in the past. And the resources you require include evidence, pieces of evidence, and you interpret this evidence. Now, what about biography? Biography is essentially a species of historical writing. That's one of the types, a type of historical writing. It is the life story of a person written by someone else. If it is written by oneself, it is called autobiography. So that book that the gentleman kindly referred to, which is my biography written by myself, is titled as A Trajectory of Life and Autobiography, which means I wrote it myself. So when somebody is writing about me, it's biography. When I'm writing about myself, it's autobiography. Now, the methodology of biography is essentially not different from that of other forms of historical writing. The methodology is the same. Now, let me move on to the importance of history and biography. The Roman scholar called Cicero stresses the importance of history, including biography, in his work titled De Oratore. This is what it says: to be ignorant of what happened before you were born is to be forever a child. For what is a man's lifetime unless the memory of past events is woven with those of earlier ones? So he said, what is life if you cannot remember or have no idea of what happened in the past and how what happened in the past connects with the present? So biographies are very, very important. It connects the past and this thing. In this one, I've described my childhood when I lived with my grandmother up to the time I grew up, went to school, when I finished school, my career, and so on. So I'm connecting various aspects of my life through time. And that is what biography does. Levi-Strauss, another historian, reinforces Cicero's comment with a warning those who ignore history condemn themselves to not know the present. He said, if you don't know the past, if you don't understand the past, how can you understand the present? Because as we just read, the two are connected. The present stems from the past. So unless you understand the past and you know what happened, you cannot understand what is going on now. Oxford University professor Hugh Trevor added in the early 1960s, quote, "We study history in order to understand how we have come to be where we are." So the whole purpose of history is like a journey. You start from point A, you have reached point D, and it tells you the stages you've passed through life. Now, this definition is also shared by another professor, Professor Walsh, who defines history as, quote, not just a plain record, not just a plain record of past events. So it's not this happened, that happened, on 28th we did this, 29th December we did it, in January we did this, just plain event. It's not just a plain record of past events, but a significant record, an account in which events are connected. So first, it's not just a plain record, just enumerating, counting what things that you did. It says it's a significant record. And this record connects events together. So for example, what is the connection between the ex-servicemen arrived at Osu in 1948 and independence, self-government? What is the connection? What part did it play? So you are connecting events. You're not simply enumerating events. Now, notwithstanding the fact that it is history that links our present to our past, many of our generation do not see a virtue in its study. Either they consider a great deal of it to be invention or imagination, or they consider it as a dull subject suitable only for dullards. But for those who value it, history is perceived as playing the same role for human society as the human brain does for the individual. Society does not have a memory of its own. Historians are the memory of society. So what your brain does for you, you go to sleep, you get up, and you see some flowers around you, and you wonder, how did this happen? It is the brain that will explain this. Your friend came here and do that. In the same way, in history, the society, why is that our country has come to be like this? It is the historian who can explain that by linking the past and the present. So, for example, the brain is able to coordinate information, perceive, and so in lieu of an organic memory, society needs history to enable it to relate to its environment. Since the collective group of people, the society, has no brain, then historians become the brain of society, who are interpreting the past to them so that people get to know what happened. The role of the historian may be likened to that of the immune system in human beings. That system establishes a memory of foreign bodies that attack the human body, so as to be able to recognize and resist them in a future recurrence of the attack. Similarly, just as failure of the human brain to function results in amnesia and disorientation, so also societies and nations can hardly have a sense of identity without historical studies. It is the historian who equips society with self-knowledge and understanding of the past to enable it to deal with contemporary problems and propose appropriate and intelligent solutions. Now, what is historiography? Which is essentially what this seminar is about. What is historiography? It's different from history. History is what has been written. Historiography concerns itself with the theory and practice of historical writing, the theory and the practice of historical writing. Essentially, it is the writing of history in accordance with accepted critical standards or systematized principles as enunciated in the cumulative perspectives and scholarship of past historians. In other words, historiography is the science and technique of writing history. The science, the technique of writing history. According to Robert Smith, its emphasis is on the practical aspects rather than the philosophical aspects of history. Herbert Butterfield defines historiography as a fundamental study whose aim is to trace the development and shaping of historical research and writing. So what historiography does is to take us through time, beginning with the basis, how history has been perceived and how history has been written. So it's cumulative. How did the people of the 17th century write history? How did the people of the 18th century write history? How are people of the 20th century write history? That is historiography. To trace the development and the shaping of historical research and writing. Now, we come to history and historiography before the 19th century. Briefly, I want to take you through what existed before we come to it. Before the 19th century, there were two opposing traditions of historical writing. One, the ecclesiastical historiographical tradition, and two, the Western secular historiographical tradition. Between the 6th century BC, when the first one started, if you like, and now, historiography has passed through 5 stages of evolution. Let's say stage 1, that covers ancient world from 3000 to 500 BC. During that epoch, an intellectual revolution occurred in Ionia in Greece, during which Greek intellectuals of the period made an effort to understand and explain the human past in a rational way. In that epoch, men believed that historical events were controlled by supernatural powers, namely God and the gods. Consequently, they envisaged history as the unfolding of the plans and purposes of the spirit forces that controlled men's lives. No effort was therefore made to provide rational explanations for events. It didn't explain why things happened the way they did. Hence, the works such as the works of people like Homer, Homer's Iliad, Odyssey, which otherwise are great works of literature, their own right, were not considered as true historical accounts, but as a blend of legend, myth, and a modicum of authentic tradition. Stage 2 was the classical age of Greece and Rome, about 500 BC to 175 AD. The classical age of Greece and Rome was the age of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all of Greece, and Cicero, Caesar, Virgil, and Horace, all of Rome. It was in this period that the foundations were laid for the study of history. The foundations included awareness of the following considerations. One, the need to take cognizance of facts in history. You cannot write history without facts. Two, the use of human reason to analyze, to break the things into pieces and try to understand them. Three, the need to be skeptical. This is a quality which every historian must have. You must be skeptical. It's not everything that you take, particularly when you go to the field. They will tell you a lot of things, but you must be discerning. You must be skeptical. That is, you must consider whether what they're telling is probable. Did it actually happen? A typical example which you always come for analogies to. If you go to a researcher and he tells you this, you use your skepticism, your brain. Is this possible? So you don't write things that are not possible. I'm sure at the time the law of gravity had not been suspended. So the stool would not have been intact when it hit the ground. Stage 3, stage 2, sorry, was the age of these people, and I've indicated the things that we need to emphasize. Stage 3 is what we call the dark and medieval ages, from the 5th century to the 15th century. The fall of Rome in 410 AD, caused by the barbarian invasions, marked the beginning of the disintegration of the classical world and of the so-called classical civilization. In the confusion that ensued through the Dark Ages into the medieval age, the Catholic Church emerged as the stabilizing force. And this opened the way for Christian historiography to gain ascendancy over classical historiography. So classical historiography went out of fashion, and now the way of writing history was to place God at the center. God is the pivot around which all things revolve. Eusebius, Bishop Eusebius, who was the Bishop of Caesarea in northern Palestine at the start of the reign of Roman Emperor Constantine. Now, he is credited with this phase. Now, the Emperor Constantine granted religious toleration to Christianity, which had been under sustained persecution. And he made the church and state complementary in 324 AD. Bishop Eusebius took advantage of the newfound freedom to publish a book titled Ecclesiastical History, about 312 AD. That book marked the opening of a new chapter in historiography. That historiography concerned itself with the story of the rise of Christianity and differed markedly in approach from classical historiography. Eusebius' book, Christian Historiography, was the Christian response to the mid-6th century intellectual revolution in Ionia, in which Ionian cosmogonists sought to replace God with human reason. The cosmogonists taught that the world was a natural world, and so, in order to know and understand it, required a conscious, rational investigation. Without a conscious, rational investigation, you could not understand the world. Bishop Eusebius' genre of history set out to dispute that. The city of God placed God at the center of history, not human reason, and postulated that history was about the unfolding of God's divine purpose for mankind. Then we move into stage 4, the Renaissance period, late 15th century, 16th century. In the medieval age, classical literature and art became moribund. But the Renaissance movement of the late 15th century and 16th century sparked of a renewed interest in them. Scholars of the Renaissance period engaged themselves in the study of rhetoric, poetry, grammar, and history. These are the fields that we refer to as the humanities. So once somebody is in the humanities, these are the fields. Renaissance humanist historians return to the classical conception of history. They attach greater importance to interpretation of the past than to detailed documentation of events. As I've said, not this happened, this happened, this happened. But interpretation became a key issue. And they emphasize utility rather than accuracy. To them, a history to be useful, it must be useful. So if it doesn't matter if parts of it were not accurate. Secularization of historiography in the Renaissance period placed man rather than God at the center of history. It emphasized human reason as the key to understanding human society and what goes on in it. Greek and Roman examples became the model for art, literature, history, philosophy. Indeed, the conduct of life everything was based on the model of the Renaissance period. The last stage is the modern era from 17th to the 19th century. Before then, as we have indicated, what passed for historical knowledge was nothing more than myths, legend, and hearsay. It was in the Ionian period, the intellectual movement that laid the foundation for the modern discipline of history for us also to build on. So the question is, how did that happen? How did the modern history emerge? They did so by distinguishing fact from myth. There's a difference between fact and myth. The example I gave, the Akrofi-Christaller thing, is a myth. It's not fact. It cannot be a fact. And it made patient observation and inquiry the basis of historical knowledge and writing. So history is based on patient observation and inquiry, which we call research. The humanist historians of the Renaissance era built upon the Ionian foundations and elaborated their tenets. In this way, they contributed to the flowering of historiography in the 17th century. It was indeed in that century that the first purposeful steps were taken towards the serious study of history. The 17th century introduced the first significant innovations in historiography in terms of, one, subject matter. In this respect, they recognized man as the subject or the focus of historical study. Two, purpose. The purpose was to use human reason to discover, as to know and understand man's past using human reason. Three was causation, how things happen, how things are caused. They made a search for causes, a key ingredient of historical methodology, particularly at the level that you are writing in the university. History is not simply a chain of events, an enumeration of chain of events. You have to deal with causation, how things came to be what they are, and so on. Then you have sources. The sources are the pieces of evidence you've gathered that will help you to document, to authenticate, to affirm the truth, and ensure that history does not become a figment of the imagination. History is not guesswork. It's not a figment. It's based on fact. So sources are crucial to documentation. Then skepticism, to ensure that every story about the past was the truth. You have to be skeptical. You have to have a doubting mind. You go into the field and they tell you a lot of things. Some of them are simply improbable. But they tell it to you, and if you're not careful, you are going to use this as well. So you must have a skeptical mind. Ask yourself, these things that they are telling me, did they actually happen? Are they reality? So then a style. They adopted prose language, what the Greeks called simple speech, and emphasized that historical composition must be lucid and fluid. The 18th century gave birth to historical method, and the 19th century revolutionized the historical method. It also inaugurated what we call professional history. Now, to summarize the essential characteristics of historical writing in the classical and Renaissance epochs. One, they stressed the natural world as the subject matter of historical study, not God. Two, they followed a new secularism which promoted and affirmed the primacy of human reason. That human reason is number one in man's quest for improved and better life. Three, the use of concrete data of human experience, factual, empirical evidence. This was encouraged as the raw material for history. Then reliance was placed on a wide range of sources. You don't use only one source for historical writing. You use a variety of sources for writing history. Personal observation, eyewitness accounts, oral tradition, literary works. All these come into use. Then finally, utility was stressed at the expense of accuracy. But today, if history is not accurate, it's of no use to anybody. Explanation and lessons from interpretation of the past were encouraged to guide present conduct. You interpret the past to serve as a guide to conduct in today's world. In the event, it was not matter, it did not matter, as I said, if it was not. The emphasis was in utility. So it doesn't matter if some of your facts are not true. Once the objective is met. In the Renaissance period, Machiavelli introduced into historical writing what we call the inductive method. Now, inductive reasoning is the process of discovering general principle from a set of facts. That's what the scientists do. You go from this reasoning to conclusions, and the conclusions become the scientific knowledge, or whatever you call it. That is to say, a historian should avoid arriving at conclusions by referring to principles and judgments deemed to be valid. You see, there are certain things, there are certain theories. This. So this becomes the basis of analysis without reference to whether that thing is proven or not proven. So this was also used by the historians of the period. The inductive method insisted that it was not enough to merely describe an ideal set of behavioral patterns. Just don't describe patterns. This was happening and then hold them as models for improvement. That people to improve, oh, this were the things that were done. So you look at this, these are the ways to go and improve yourself. That the historian should seek to represent things as they are in real truth. The thing is that if you're writing about the past, try to represent the past as it was in real truth, rather than as they are imagined. People are encouraged not to focus on traditional Christian ethics of the time, but look at the reality. What was the reality? What really happened? Historians were encouraged to argue from evidence to reach conclusions. So you start from evidence to conclusions. You don't start with conclusions and then try to find evidence to support them. Conclusions should not be merely deduced from some theory. They must be empirical and verifiable. And so they emphasize sense impressions. Now, I might admit here, what I've been teaching here is mostly from the point of view of secular historiography, because I'm not a theologian. But the important thing to note is that whether you're doing secular history or this, the basic steps you take are the same. It's only when you come to the interpretation that you have some formula that you use to interpret your fact. So whilst teaching, I keep on emphasizing to this and that. My historiography is giving you an overview of what it was. Parts of it will help you to do your research and your interpretation, but also I'm not mindful of the fact that you have your explanatory scheme, which you use when interpreting the hard facts that you have gathered. So we move to embarking on biographical research, the rudimentary steps. Step one is the background reading. The writing of academic history begins with curiosity, and you are doing academic history with curiosity about the past and a strong itch to research and document it for the benefit of posterity. This necessitates taking a number of steps towards that goal. First, the researcher needs to spend time on literature survey. This begins with preliminary reading of available, relevant, and pertinent writings on the intended subject of biographical study. If you want to write on A, you start reading all the things you can lay hands on that have been written about A. Now, when you read this, you reflect on them with a view to making the following decisions. One, has this person been studied previously? The subject of the biography. Have other scholars studied him? And if they have studied him, is the study sufficient? If so, was the study thorough enough? Or are there gaps in the study that make further study desirable and necessary? So you see that people have written about other people, still others want to write again on them because all had not been said. A lot have been left out. Three, are there enough resources to assist the inquiry? For example, are there enough informants who are knowledgeable enough and willing and ready to grant oral interviews? Persons willing to transcribe the interview into English if the researcher does not speak the interviewee's native language. If you are speaking, say you are Akan, you're doing research in Hausa areas, you need somebody who will just translate the interview into the language that you want it to be translated, transcribed. Is there enough written material, documentation on his life that can be readily accessed? So you are trying to gather all the information that you possibly can about that person. Do you have informants who can help you to do that? 3, libraries, archives, pictures, monuments. They all have a story to tell. Do you have these that you can consult for the work that you want to do? At the end of step 1, the student must have a tentative idea of what aspects of the topic have been fully covered. Or if they are not fully covered, which areas are still virgin. And these have not been fully done, so I can still go into that field and top it up. 2, the potential thrust. What's the direction of the study? 3, the title of your study. 4, the nature of the content. What is going to go into this study? And then the range, the variety of sources that are available to you for consultation, information on the study. Step 2 is embarking on research. Before embarking on research, one has to first reflect deeply on what one wants to research into. That is what we call the topic. Why one wants to do that research. That's called the objective. What's your purpose? Why are you studying? 3, how one intends to proceed. That is your proposal and your methodology. Then the quantum of material available for the study. That is your sources. You did these things for the research. So these are crucial things to bear in mind. Step 3 is writing your research proposal. A researcher's proposal is his response and answer raised by the study to be undertaken. Historiographical context, that is, you survey the existing works. That is the historiographical. What has been written in this field and how has it been written? Familiarize yourself with that. The purpose and objective of your study. What is the purpose of studying this person? Then the theoretical framework, the ideas, the theories, the explanatory tools that undergird the study, that inform the main thrust of the work and its conclusions. This is, some people call it the thesis. What is the thesis that you're trying to propose, which you are trying to work on? Then you have literature review. What is the present state of knowledge in your chosen field? Have any previous studies been done? What are the strengths and the weaknesses of existing studies? Are they adequate? That is your objective. So when you are writing about an area, that's what you do. Now let me give you my own example. My book on Achimogwa is the first scholarly study of the state. Maybe I'm reading a lot about it, but a different aspect. But this is the first true history of the area. Now, when I was doing this, I read European histories, and there were a lot of things that I disagreed with. And so this fulfilled my objective. For example, the Europeans said colonialism was here to civilize the African. So I tried to understand civilization and what are the landmarks of civilization: education, human freedom, decent living, all these things. So what I said to myself, to test this European thing, the Europeans were here to let me look at what they did as against what they themselves preferred to do. Okay, I take education. What did they do in the education field? I look at it, they opened only about 19 schools by 1907. built one secondary school. Is this how we're going to civilize Africans? So you see, what I did was I had a clear view of what I was going to do. To use the evidence or the sources at my disposal to disprove this content by citing them and so on. Then your methodology. How does your proposal study fit in? How does the researcher propose to approach his study? What are his sources? Archival, you specify the type, the class of documents. Non-archival, for example, interviews by questionnaire, participant observation, your mode of analysis, and then the potential contribution that your study will make to knowledge. These are usually stated in the form of statement of the problem, then literature review, aims and objectives, theoretical framework, methodology, and the design, that is the structure of the study, in which you outline the content as the chapters. This will go into chapter 1, this will go into chapter 2, this will go into chapter 3. Now, archival and field research. You begin with archival, and I will recommend that you start with archival sources. Now, history is not a figment of the imagination. It is a record of what actually happened in times past. There are often events that antedated the researcher's birth. Consequently, it needs to rely on recollections of contemporaries who were eyewitnesses to the events, and the researcher wishes to write that the researcher wants to write about. They are a very key group that you have to go. Contemporary written records. What were the writings of the period, the records, that capture bits and pieces of the events of the past? They also can help you. Diaries, newspapers, memoirs, letters, minutes of meetings, diplomatic correspondence, official speeches, court records, parliamentary proceedings. These are some of the contemporary written records. You take those that fit your project. Then you have unwritten records, photographs, maps, sketches, and so on. These bits of information from the past, which have left traces of past events and occurrences, are what historians refer to as sources. So when you say my sources are, you say I'm going to rely on these bits of information from the past, which have left traces of themselves, of the events. These are what I'm going to base my attention. Now, there are two types of sources. Written sources are divided into two categories. We have primary sources. They are those which originated as sensitive, confidential records. In those days, you could not look at them because they contained the truth. Today, civil servants are allowed to see their reports. So those who write reports on them are careful. But in those days, you had the 30-year rule. Nobody's going to see what I've written about you until 30 years' time. So I can say anything. I hope that within the next 4 years, you won't attack me. But today, people are careful. They are more often than not kept under lock and key away from the eye of authorized person. They are usually in archives or museums. Two, secondary sources consist of narratives, prose compositions built out of primary sources. So, for example, I use primary sources to write my history of Ashimobo. But once I finish, that book now becomes a secondary source. You may use it, but it's a secondary source. And if you rely on that alone, your thesis is not going to be passed. You must go direct to the same sources that I use, because you may want to reinterpret some of the things I interpreted. Secondary sources consist of narratives, that's monographs, what we call books, journal articles, theses. These are all secondary sources. There are also sources that exist in unwritten form: oral tradition, rituals, archaeological finds, proverbs, drum, horn language, place names. All these things yield considerable data for your work. After satisfying yourself or going through this of the feasibility of the study and defining its scope, the student now begins with archival research. Archival research, I suggest first, because it will raise a lot of things which may be clarified when you go to the field. First, how do I assess the right document in the archives? There is what they call class list in the archives, which contain all the documents stored in the library. For example, in the Public Records Office in London, you have CO 98. This deals with Gold Coast Native Affairs Department. So if you're dealing with colonialism, for us, this is a source that you cannot afford to miss. Now, in Prague, the reference is ADM, administrative. So these contain the reports of the district commissioners, the provincial commissioners. Every 3 months, they had to submit a quarterly report to Accra, detailing things in the district, marriage, deaths, crime, economic activities, political activity. All these are listed. So if you take the ADM series, you get all the information about the area that you are studying. In Prague, as I said, there's the ADM. Now, you have to correctly reference the work for easy identification and retrieval. The man who is giving you the documents will simply look at, what you tell him is what he does. So you have to know exactly what you want. So you spend some time in the archives going through this thing and listing the documents you think will be of help to you. So once you are in the archives, you simply take out a paper. They'll give you a small paper, put on this and say, these are the documents I want. And then they'll go and retrieve them for you. When you finish, you return them, they bring you another set. Now, when you're taking notes, you need not take them verbatim, word for word. You can develop your own abbreviations in order to move faster. You may paraphrase, for example. It's only when you are quoting that you quote exactly. Your quotations must be dead accurate. You cannot afford to put into somebody's mouth what he has not said. So quotations must be dead accurate. Do not gloss over comments in the minutes. Sometimes alongside the margins, you'll find comments. Comments can reveal a lot to you. The state of the mind of the colonial official or whoever was minuting, and so on. They'll give you an idea of the policy preferences, how the official, what official thinking was, what the prejudices were, and so on. Now, was present for chiefs as against educated elite, genuine respect for tradition and institution. I found that the reasons for preferring chiefs who were largely elite was not because they wanted to preserve our traditions and culture, but because they thought the educated African was too arrogant and diplomatic, so they wanted to take him out of the equation. So the margin comments are very, very useful. Abolition of slavery, an act of humanity or sheer opportunism. The margin comments, the comments on the documents can help you. Then you come to field research. In preparing for field research, you have to have your resources, the questionnaire, the tape recorder, tapes, batteries, and notebooks, etc. You have to make appointments, the criteria for choice of respondents. Why are you choosing Mr. A to be your respondent? Is it on account of his verified knowledge, or because you just think because he's a big man in the area, they can give you information. So you must have the correct reason for choosing the person you are choosing to interview, not his status, but his acknowledged understanding, knowledge of that area. Design of questions. The questions, how you design your questions are very important. Can you describe the economy of this community? You will ask one of your interviewees in the rural area. It's a wrong question. The right question is, what do people in this community do for a living? That way, you bring them in and they can tell, oh, some are farmers. So that's not a place to display your knowledge of the English language, to bamboozle them. Simplify the language so that they cannot afford to miss the essence of the question you are asking. Questions need to be administered, need not be administered serially. That because you have 80 questions, you start from number 1, number 2, number 3. Sometimes you find that in answer number 1, he has answered number 10. So you don't need to repeat that again. Now, keep interruptions at the barest minimum in the course of the narration, because this upsets particularly the uneducated people. Their mind runs in a certain direction. So if you keep on interrupting, they forget what they have in mind to tell you. What are the things that you need to take? Responses to the questions, proverbs, recitals, anecdotes, songs, appellations. Then souvenirs that you may want to collect are photographs. Ask for photographs relevant to the research, write-ups like family histories. Some people may have documents with them, date of birth, date of this thing. Now, you'll be surprised that when I was doing my presentation for the Offerata lecture, the amount of information we had. For the first time, I saw Offerata's children, all of them listed. It starts with the name of the mother, 80 children, the name of the mother, the name of the child, his mother's name, the date of birth. All these things are listed. Something that will help if our catechists in the rural areas will start documenting the people they baptize and keep records for the sake of this program. Now, the historiographical course, I'm concluding. The historiographical course at ACI attempts to blend the relevant aspects of the secular and the divine purpose approaches. So I'm using the two approaches I used. And I tell students that where it is not appropriate, use the relevant or the correct thing that you're being taught here. But for most of your research work and so on, you will find that there is no difference between what you do here and what we do at, say, Lego. So that makes the course much broader in scope to accommodate a diversity of approaches and equip research students generally with all the rudimentary skills in historical research and writing history. The critical examination of sources, the selection of particular details therefrom, and the synthesis of the selected material. So essentially, this is what you examine your sources and decide which ones are appropriate to your study. You select the particular details from it, which will help you to write. And in writing, what you're doing is synthesizing the selected materials into a coherent narrative that will stand the test of critical examination. So when your examiners come around, you have fulfilled all these requirements and they'll be happy with your work. My time is up, so I will stop here, and then I think later on, I'll hear that later on there'll be a session for questions and answers, and I'll see how best I can answer your questions. thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you also very much, Prof. We are deeply grateful for sharing with us so much information on the fundamentals we need in place to be able to undertake biographical research and a broader context within which we have to carry that out. Thank you very, very much. We will proceed actually with the question and answer session. If you have a question, yes.
Do we do it now or according to the program? I thought this was going to come at the end of it, but I'll be happy to take the questions now if that's allowed. Oh, okay.
So we will begin with a question and answer session.
Go.
Yes, thank you. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand or mute your mic and ask the question, or use the chat column to pose your question and then we'll take it up. So the floor is open.
Yeah, Rector.
Yes, Prof. Lai.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much for this presentation. Just a quick one on your experience of Abrewanana.
That is it. It's a model for those who want to write biography.
Yes. I recall that I visited in a couple of days times in your house, and we had some discussion on, and I was quite fascinated by the record keeping. Of course, well, you mentioned your days in Accra Academy before you go to Accra Academy and all that. What role does record keeping, and particularly relying on memory? Because if you don't keep diaries, I was just wondering what you could have done, about all these records in the 30s and early 40s and all that. So what advice do you have for those who intend to write their biographies, autobiography, what they should even begin to do now?
Okay. Now, what I do, even till today, what I do is that I read the newspapers and I just mention issues in the, I have a diary. I've kept a diary since my secondary school days, every year, so I can give you all those records. So when you come to write any project, all I do is go to my diary. I know, oh, this diary talking about the drowning of the 13 people. This just how I list it. It's there, and the sources are there, graphic page, so and so. So I don't have a difficulty. All I have to do is to look for graphic of that day and then look at this thing. So it's important to keep records in your personal life. At least your children, your grandchildren will come to see the diaries and they'll be informed. A lot of data that they can put to good use. So I think otherwise all you have is the archives and then the, other places. So I would strongly recommend keeping diaries.
Yeah, and just a follow-up. In your time, you're writing a lot of letters, and I believe that people still have in their possession letters that they are still keeping. Today, the art of letter writing is almost gone. So people are writing the emails, WhatsApp, and all that. What is your opinion on that? How do we go about it?
Well, I see it as posing a threat in some ways. After all, those who write these things, except how many of them put their names to it? And how many of them do you know and can vouch for? If you can vouch for them, then do you use what they've written as authoritative and correct? So it poses a lot of danger. Unless you know the person that is writing, you know it's an acknowledged scholar, for example, on Asante history, and is writing something in the papers, sure, you can rely on it. His name is there, and you can use it. But some coffee men say, oh, this is somewhere you don't know. Suddenly comes and it propounds a lot of rights. You can't use it, because that is why you have citation of sources. You have to cite the sources as your authority. In other words, what you are saying is that if you don't believe me, and this, go and look at this authority. And this person is not an authority. And so if you don't cite properly, that can even be grounds for referring your thesis or for failing it. Because the history we read, though based on facts, strictly speaking, is based on facts. So you have the facts before you interpret. If you don't have the facts, how can you interpret? So the facts must be accurate. And I agree with you that it's a threat. So you may use them if they are authoritative. You know the person is reputed to be knowledgeable in that field. Then it's all right. But if you have doubts, I wouldn't advise it.
Thank you. I see Stephen Doku, your hand is up. I want, Stephen Doku, is your hand up? All right, Dr. Waigi.
Oh, yes, thank you, Prof. And Prof. Addo, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to listen to you again and to be educated and to be reminded things that are so essential, but we don't pay too much attention to. So thank you, and great to see you again. I'm very glad.
Thank you.
I was going to begin on a lighthearted note, following up what Professor Lai has mentioned about you. If you could share some insight, some secret to your longevity, especially your mental longevity and sharpness. You've alluded to the diary, but if there's more, maybe some secret portions, maybe you could share with us. But my question is to do with the distinction between, I think you used once the phrase discernment and skepticism.
Yes.
So discernment you only mentioned once, but skepticism you repeated a few times as an attitude to deploy in the historicity. My question is, at a time when whether it's through social science or maybe the dominance of a secular outlook to life.
Yes.
It's so easy to judge and dismiss just because something is religious or something is beyond our scope of understanding. So I'm just wondering whether skepticism ought to be the attitude of the Christian scholar rather than the discernment aspect. Openness, yes, affirming, yes, but still seeking discernment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think by skepticism, what I really am looking at is the source. You must be skeptical about the source you are using.
Yeah.
Because as I say, there's so much deceit these days. In the archives, for example, let me tell you an experience I had. When I was teaching at Legon, my colleague, Dr. Baku, who was also practicing as a lawyer, had a case in court. And what happened was that a family, an old man in the Kwawu area, had given part of his land to somebody from northern Ghana to look after for him, caretaker, because his children were not interested in farming. And somehow, his children, after generations, decided to forge documents to own the farm outright after the old man was gone. So Dr. Baku was holding hearing that case. So he came to me and said, according to them, the document that we're holding was even signed by the district commissioner, and they have that document. Now I looked at it, and instinctively I told Mr. Kofi, this is a forgery. There was no district commissioner for Kwawu before 1875. It was only later, that it was part of the Ashanti area. It was only after this that the DC was. In fact, there's a record in which the Ochenhi, for example, was saying that there was interference in its affairs from Ashanti and other places. And you had even, the Kwawu chief also had asked to be given protection from Ashanti control, because Kwawu was under Ashanti administration. So for anybody to say that he has a document signed by the DC for Kwawu before 75, it's forged, the document.
Right.
This is what helped him to win the case.
Right.
You see, so this is what I mean by being skeptical about the document merely because it's on paper. Does not mean that it is correct, it's true. So this is what discerning is, as you know, I agree with you, that will come into interpretation. So we always say that historians argue about interpretation, but not the facts. We all agree on the facts. We use the same fact. But when we come to interpret, then people's outlook, people's background, people's culture, all intrude. And so you have different interpretations. So I agree with you. What I mean by skepticism is be sure of the authenticity of the document that you are using.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Prof. I will choose.
Yeah, Emmanuel Titi.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Pardon? I have a problem with my ears, my hearing.
From the list of raised hands, Emmanuel Titi, I think, is the next person.
Okay.
Emmanuel, are you there? Okay. Yeah, Emmanuel, go ahead. Emmanuel, are you there?
I think he has left the meeting, Rector.
Okay. The next is Jonas from the list here.
Yes, thank you, sir. Prof, it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
It's always a good time to hear you speaking. Today, I picked on the word inductive.
The word?
Inductive.
Inductive.
Yeah, as an aid to historical interpretation.
Okay, let me what I've done.
It is something that you spoke about.
Yes, I did. I want to call exactly what I said. I was talking in connection with the modern secular historians who are saying that there's a method they call inductive method, which means that you proceed from the facts as you know them to the drawing of conclusions out of the facts. So their conclusions will come out of the facts that you have been able to. So if the facts are wrong, then what you are saying is also wrong. I just wanted to see what I made that look at it.
My question.
I think I was dealing with was it the 18th or the 19th century?
Yes.
The relationship that's happened there. What they understood by inductive reasoning was that you discover general principles from a set of facts. And my understanding of that, now I want to say that Kofi is a criminal. I'm saying Kofi, what are the facts that will point to, listen, he stole from here, he murdered somebody here. These facts that I cite are the basis of the conclusion that he's a criminal. So this is where that you draw your conclusions from the set of facts that you have adduced. So if the conclusion does not follow from the fact you have, then it's not appropriate, the conclusion, but it must logically flow from the facts that you have cited. This is my understanding of that thing.
Yeah, my question is that if incidentally this method can be used for biblical studies, if the Bible acts the base for facts, but then the period with which you refer to followed a tradition of two English people, Baconian and Thessian. So, but what I'm being careful about is the fact that something like that has historically been developed in an English context. And if I want to use it to substantiate my methodology in biblical studies, then I have to make a reference to the fact that this theory has emerged from an English context. So my problem is that, but then I also know that within the context of Akrofi, we are trying to limit the import of Western entanglement in the way we study. But by you mentioning this as a historical tool for interpretation, I see it also as a viable tool for biblical studies, which in actual sense is being used in theological circles. So how far can we go in terms of using things that have been established within the English academic environment and tested and also engage them in a historical analysis or our studies within the context of the African theological scholarship?
Okay. I was careful to tell you that there are two traditions of historiography that you are dealing with at the here. And that's why I'm careful. I'm just telling you what we in the secular field have accepted. So that, for example, if somebody was writing a thesis for me in Lagos, and he draws conclusions that are not based on the facts that he has adduced, I'm not going to pass that thesis. But I've also said that here you have a different worldview. And here you have an explanatory scheme, which is accepted. So within that context, it is yours that should prevail. If somebody used yours, for example, in Lagos, where it's writing a secular history, it's likely to be condemned. So this is not factual. We don't have, this is not factual evidence, so we can't accept it. You know, like when you, I, as a Christian, I know what role God has placed in mind. Sometimes, you know, the things that happen to me cannot be a result of divine right. But if I'm writing a secular history for purposes of examination, my concern is to get a degree, isn't it? So I do what the institution requires for me to do. When you have finished your thesis, like after I finished there are a lot of things that my supervisor disagreed with me, but which I insisted on, and I've included them. So I'm talking about this in the context of an institution. You know exactly how to interpret, the tools of interpretation. But I'm limiting myself strictly to the methodology, gathering your evidence, looking at the evidence and so on. So wherever you think the secular interpretation does not conflict with the scheme in Akropong, then you can use that. Where it digresses from it, then what should prevail is what is being done here. So it's just an overview.
I think one of my basic concern is the fact that, can I actually say that the theory I'm using.
Jonas.
Yes, sir.
Please yield the floor to somebody else.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Please, what I would say is that if you are convinced, discuss this with your supervisor, and if your supervisor approves of it, it means he shares your views, and in an examination situation, he can help you defend what you're saying. It's very important because the university has requirements. They have the frame of mind, and you can't go outside it. So what I'm trying to do is, this is what we do in the secular context. This is how we write history. Whatever is applicable, you adopt it. If it's not applicable, you do what the institution requires you to do. That's all I can say.
Okay.
Yes, please, Rector. Can you hear me now, please? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my question follows. It's related to what Dr. Waigi asked earlier concerning the issue of skepticism in evaluating the narratives that we get on the field. Now, in explaining the basis for our skepticism, Prof alluded to scientific.
Yes, I'm listening. I'm listening.
Yes, but the point is researching within religion. You may not have to always allude to such scientific facts. Yes, Prof have made a point that he is referring to scientific research. But even within the social sciences, there is also the sociological aspect of the people you are investigating. And in our African context, we know that issues of the sacred is given so much weight in the worldview of the people. So, Prof, my question is, when you are evaluating facts that you pick on the ground, even within social scientific research, to what extent do you take into consideration the socio-religious worldview of the people in relation to the Kofi Anokye story, for instance, which you've used as an example?
No, I would have loved if you could give an example that I can relate to.
Yes, so probably I'm using the Kofi Anokye one.
We are talking of facts, and I give one example that is common knowledge, that people have written in their history books that the golden stool came from heaven. Is this a fact? You see, fact in the sense, your senses, your empirical. In our secular, we rely on empirical evidence, things that you can see, things you can verify, and so on. So if somebody wrote this for me, I would not accept it by the dictates of the tradition that I belong to. But if in your field, this is allowed, why not? Then, so that's why I'm saying that most of the things that I'm saying are to my experience as a secular historian. At any point where it does not agree with what you are doing here, what it is, the framework that you is what should obtain. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that at Legon and the other universities where we're dealing with secular history, these are the things we do. There are areas where you do similar things, But for example, in gathering your, this was the technique of your questioning and so forth. You are looking for facts. You know, you are not looking for opinions or what you're looking for facts, explanation. People tell you that this happens and therefore, as a result, this happens. If the explanation is sound, okay. If it is not sound, you don't accept it. So that's why I made a point that it's a combination of two worlds. What we do in the secular area, and that is how we gather data. That is what we mean by sources, concrete experience, things borne up by human experience. You do those things. But while in your field, if that thing is not accepted, why not? Because you are writing, you are not writing for the traditional or secular historian. You are writing for Akrofi-Christaller. So that is how you use it. So it's just an open thing. I'm giving you an overview of how history, secular history has been written over time. If there are areas that you disagree with, perhaps you can do something in your thesis that will be an innovation and which will make your thesis a different thing, which will be acclaimed worldwide. But my simple job is this is how history is written in the secular world, where there are no differences between this and it. You use it. Where it is contrary to what you're doing here, particularly in the explanatory realms, the theories, then I don't see why you cannot use that. I'm not knowledgeable in that area, so I won't presume to debate you on those things.
Well, thank you. Dr. Maureen here, Nacho, and then Joseph JB, and then Dr. Ndila. So, Dr. Maureen.
Hey, Maureen.
Maureen, are you there? Unmute and let's hear you, please. Oh, she left. I'm sure she'll be back.
Oh, I haven't left. I'm here. Can you hear me?
You have to wait. Joseph. Joseph JB.
Yes, sir.
Okay, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Prof, for your presentation. Very, very insightful. I just have a few follow-up questions from Professor Lai's question, or the issue he raised on the use of modern media and communication. And I wanted to interrogate further how these count as primary sources. For instance, you cannot write a history of President Trump without looking at his tweets. A WhatsApp conversation could very well lead you into the mind of a scholar or a historical figure, a person you're investigating to write a biography. So I just wanted a bit more clarity on how these modern media, for instance, a Facebook post or a series of Facebook posts, can constitute a primary source that helps you to formulate a biography or to dig into the mind of the person you're investigating. And also to find out if WhatsApp conversations, because of distance, you might have someone you are investigating and they are not close by. So a series of emails might be the primary source for some of your writing. Is that also something that is viable? Thank you.
It's very, very problematic. If your own research, you know, the traditional sources of research, the archives and so on and so on, I believe the proper places to depend on for an MPhil or a PhD thesis. And remember also that in most of these emails and so on, they hardly authenticate the sources of the information. You don't know where that information is coming. You just put there. So if you are asked to defend it, how do you defend it? Somebody that Mr. A and so on killed somebody in a public place, everybody was there and so on. They said he killed this. Do you have, say, a photograph to show? Photograph of the scene. How can I believe what you're saying without any documentation, without telling me the source of the information, where you got that information from? So I have a problem with that. They just put the thing back on the screen and everybody accepts that as the truth. Whereas if you go deeply into it, you say that what they're saying is false. So are you using false data? So the problem is, how do you vouch for the authenticity of the information that is being put there? If you have the means of checking and you have every reason to believe that is true, then you can use them prepared to defend it. Otherwise, I would say you should be very worried about using most of them are made up. That's all I can say about that. Yeah. For serious academic work, I think you have to be a little more careful.
Dr. Maureen, are you back?
Yes, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes,
hello, Prof. It's nice to see you.
It's good to see you.
I see all the familiar voices. I'm so happy I could join in. Yes. Prof, thank you so much for that very, very insightful and rich presentation. I want to talk about, this kind of, I think, a dispute that we've been having about discernment and skepticism. I think from your presentation, what I got is that we're talking about facts. You say empirical, verifiable, authentic, documented evidence. So if we're doing that, then can we say there are facts for Christian historians and other facts for secular historians? Because you seem to run back into saying at the university what you teach is secular history. But history is for everybody. History affects everybody, not just Christians and secular people, even those who are in between or on the fringes. If it is God's world, is there a world for Christians? And is there a world for secular people? I believe in what you've presented. You're urging us to see the connections. The facts are the same for everybody. So it is how we go about getting those facts and how we interpret them and how we use them to write a history or life history of a person or a society. That's what is significant. That's my own reading, because, we sometimes, or I think maybe we're in the danger of spiritualizing historiography, so that when we use a word like discernment, it makes it Christian. But discernment is a neutral word. Anybody can be discerning. Of course, if you're a Christian, your discernment is enriched by the presence of the Holy Spirit, the Word of God. But even traditional people can have discernment. I think you can call it intuition. Yes. So I'm thankful for the explanation and the distinction you've made between skepticism. It's not a negative thing. It's just try to be objective. Don't let emotions and other things filter into the facts that you want to analyze. I hope I heard you right. But it's so lovely to see you.
For coming to my head. Yes, what I'm saying, that this historian, from which the word derives, is talking about a search for facts, for information. That's how the name derives. So we want to say that on this program on Saturday, Dr. Iheanacho spoke or made a contribution. Is that a fact? That is a fact. So I said, why did he decide to come on this program? That is where you're dealing with interpretation. Somebody will say, oh, he wanted to call him to show, to get contact with their friends and so on. Or somebody say, oh, he wanted to be seen on television. That's what I do. You have different interpretation, viewpoint. That is, and that's what the discernment, unusual insights that you have. So it's in the realms of interpreting what you say. But the fact, everybody, whether you are a Christian or this thing, for example, accept if you are talking about persecution of Christians, the facts are the same. But why were the Christians persecuted? That is where you are a divergence of, oh, they were persecuted because this, another say, oh no, they were that. So for me, that is why I say that the facts are the same for all of us. Fact is a fact. If I say we held a symposium here today, it's a fact. You can't change it. But what you say of the fact depends on your worldview on this, and that's the realm of interpretation. So that's how I understand this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dr. Miller Johnson.
Yes. I want to say that I have learned a lot from this, and I'm very grateful to Professor and what he has outlined. And I have some few things that they are very hypothetical, but they may border on reality as well. On the biographical research, the first thing is there an ethical framework, ethical framework of where one can go and where one cannot go? Are there parameters to what one can do? In other words, on this biographical essays or what we write, is it selective, leaving out the bad and the ugly and concentrating on the good for a purpose on which you are writing such biography? That's the first one. The second one is that in some of these biographies that we read, you can see subjectivity in them and not objectivity, because the writer has a point to prove, and what the writer wants to prove, whether factual or imagined, conditions how the biography is put in place. In a situation like that, last two things. Will the autobiography written by the person that may contradict the biography of the writers, will the autobiography have the final word? The last one is historiography provides the grounds for a critical analysis where you take the contradictions together and make mention to them in order that you may arrive at a mean or allow the contradictions to exist and come out with an opinion based on the facts that you have. Are you allowed to do that in any case without mixing things up?
Okay, I'll respond to I think the last but one that you made. What we're saying that history is made up of two. There's the objective fact that nobody can dispute. Can anybody dispute that it was under Kwame Nkrumah that Ghana gained independence? I don't think even the most die-hard NPP man will say no. Everybody accepts because people saw, they lived at the time, they participated in the ceremonies. So this is a hard fact that nobody has known. But if you move on to say what were the intentions of Kwame Nkrumah in leading this country to independence? There will be a host of interpretations. Someone said, oh, he wanted to, it was personal aggrandizement. He wanted it to, listen, he was in England, he was unemployed, and they asked Akwaji to help him get a job. So when he came here, he was looking for this. Another person, see, because interpretation comes from many, and your religious beliefs can affect the way you interpret. Your culture can in fact affect it. That gives you the perspective. And we don't have, so we recognize that you have the facts and then you have that is why usually the juicy part is in the interpretation. Somebody gives an interpretation based on facts. Another scholar, based on the same fact, gives another interpretation. And people look at it and say, oh, I like this interpretation, this one is better than that. So interpretation, reinterpretation are going on all the time. So for me, I cannot lay down a hard fight for anybody. It's only about the methodology, how you gather your facts, how you ascertain the validity of those facts. Then the next day you go to this. There's a host of views and opinions. And that is where all these philosophical ideas that you're talking come from. And people are allowed to do that. You cannot say this is the only way. No examiner can hold you to, as long as what you are saying makes sense, because we are promoting knowledge. And knowledge grows by opposition of ideas. So I don't want to say that this is the way to go. Apart from collecting your data, you have the data before you. As for interpreting the data, the sky is the limit. Any interpretation that you give that makes sense, and the examiner is not going to, he may say, I disagree with it, but it's a logical conclusion from what you have presented. And people, I've examined this and other. Sometimes I disagree with what the person said, but it's so beautifully done, logically, all that he's saying makes sense. So why? I wouldn't let my disagreement with personal disagreement. And we all have, prejudices. So my concern is not so much at the interpretation level. That's why I say here in Akrofi, you are taught how to interpret data. So my concern is with the data. I have to make sure, if I go to the field and somebody tells for example, I was born in 1948, and yet he tells me that in 1941, Prempeh crossed the Pearl River for the first time to come to Accra. He saw it. It's a contradiction. If you were born in 48, and we are talking about happening in 47, how can you say that you saw it? It's true. What your version is true. I'll be skeptical about taking your version. So these are the little things I'm drawing your attention to, that you want to scrutinize and make sure that the facts are reliable. The next stage is your interpretation, because this is not just narrating many, many facts. You have to, the sweeter part of it is in the interpretation, because that is what gives us new directions and where to go and so on. So it's welcome. It's a welcome part. As long as the interpretation you're giving flow from the facts you have adduced, I have no problem with that. The type of, and I read it, I see a lot of people, that's not my field, but I think I agree with you. I don't think any examiner or this thing has the answer to everything. So, as I keep saying, my job is to say, this is how history is written. Parts of it apply to everybody writing, no matter the type. If you are writing about Muslims, you are writing about. The idea is that what you are saying must be factual. Once it's factual, and you say, out of this fact, this is my viewpoint. So interpretation is different, but the facts are the same for everybody. So So we quarrel about interpretations. We don't quarrel about facts. That's what I can say.
Okay. Marcel, are you around?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you want to ask your question now?
Yes, sir. Prof, it's exciting seeing you again. Prof. Addo Fening, I'm very glad to see you. This is Marcel back from Cameroon. Please, I've listened to you speak very passionately this topic time and again because you took us through this historiography. My difficulty now is about myth and excitement.
What?
Myth.
Myth and excitement.
The contribution of myth in history, in making history, and the excitement that go with it. There's some excitement. There are some certain things, certain myths that each time somebody say that, like the conformity school, the school that you're talking about, you know the excitement that goes with it with Akan people, talking about their strength and how powerful they are, the part that that school played even in the fight that they had with the colonial people. So now, bringing in this particular word, skepticism that is always coming in, how do we manage such area in history? The area of myth, because every people have myths that make up their story. The Ga people will talk about coming from the sea. These other people will say they came from this direction. This one say they came from here. People come from different areas, and those myths have accompanied them in centuries. Historians go to the field, and the people keep saying they have to interview 100 people, and maybe all of them, after giving you their facts, they link themselves to that myth and telling you that it is where we come from, it is this. How do we manage such aspects?
Okay. Well, if I understood the question well, I think what I tell students is that myths are part of the human experience. You know, the fact that you take the Akrofi-Christaller thing again. Why did Akrofi-Christaller? I think the important thing to us is why did Akrofi-Christaller do this? Ashanti was not yet a united people. There were small states around the Kumasi area and the Bakwai area. And Denchina was a superpower, and Denchina was harassing them. Denchina wanted to pass through Kumasi to go and trade in Gonja and all the other things. So that was the time that the Ashanti Union was formed. And incidentally, if you look at the terminology, it's a certainty because of war. They united because of war, because they were small independent states. So they had a common purpose. And whatever would serve that purpose and make the nation strong was it. So this myth, certainly in interpretation, I would say it was a very useful thing because it helped unite the nation. It just told them that this has come from the skies. As long as you have this in, you are going to be united, will be stronger. And look at Asante today. It's the most dominant tribe in this thing. So in evaluating, in interpretation, this is what has made Asante what it is, a great nation united. Because they believe in this. So the belief that they have in the myth is what is keeping them united and going. So that belongs to the era of interpretation. But you can mention the myth. The myth is a fact that Akrofi-Christaller told them this came from. It's the fact that this is what he told them. For me, that is a fact. But is what he said true? That is where I have to go into interpretation and give you my own views. I said no. So I advise students that when you say according to, then you are reporting what people are saying. You are not saying it's true. You are reporting. According to this thing, you are all right. People can go investigate and say, we don't agree. But I'm not saying it's true. It came from. I'm saying this is what the people. But the moment you say categorically that the golden stool descended from heaven, as a historian, and what is the evidence? What's the proof? That is how we work. But once this thing is established, yes, that though it was a myth, it played a great role in the rise of Asante to power, no doubt about that. But the issue itself was a myth. So there's a difference between, it depends on how you put it. If you are categorical and we say this is what the history is about, what actually happened. So once you say it happened, I want proof. Give me the evidence. Show me, for example, picture of this thing descending. Anything to convince me to accept it. So this is how I think we should view it. You can still talk about myths, that this is what is said, and they have a useful place in history. But as to whether the myth itself should be recorded as factual is what I think we are contesting. But it's not true, but it has been very useful in the development of Asante power.
Well, we are getting close to the end of our time together. Maybe, Prof, let me ask maybe the last question. Let me ask the last question.
I thought I saw Allison's.
Allison, she had to leave, I think. But she listening. Yeah.
Your voice, I can't recognize the face. Oh, okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Just we've been emphasizing facts. And I wonder if you could comment on the danger of being selective in our facts. Not just the interpretation, but selecting the facts we want and leaving out those we don't. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is a very, very relevant point. Yes, people deliberately suppress the facts. People, if it's not complementary to them, then so you see history books. Now, somebody will, as I say, you can write a history book about Nkrumah. Okay, let me better illustrate this way. In the 1970s, one Professor Addo, my mentor, and I were doing the Digging Our Past, the television program, which was documented our history. It was a very popular program, people rushing from their jobs to get home to listen to it. We came to program, I think that was 17, and that was on Kwame Nkrumah. So I said to Professor Boahi, I said, Prof, I know your views on Nkrumah and the CPP. So if we are going to deal with this program in 30 minutes, the likelihood is that you are going to spend 20 minutes on the bad things that Nkrumah did, and only 10 minutes on the good things that he did. So would you please let us do 2 full programs, 30 minutes on Nkrumah's achievements and 30 minutes on Nkrumah's failures. That way you do justice to this thing. So it's a common thing. That is why people, after they've done research, some people come out and then the same field come and do it again. Because the information, the data that you said tended to one conclusion, whereas that conclusion is not the only conclusion. So let us look at the other side also, or have the 2 sides. If you have what Nkrumah did, what the others did, then you say, for me, this is what I do. That yes, this is what this person did, all facts. But given this and that, I think Nkrumah did better than this man, or that man did better. You can't help having these versions. They're happening all the time, distorting history. There's so much distortion. Because as one philosopher said, everybody comes to the writing of history with a point of view. And that is the point of view that's it. So somebody can write from an ethnic background, look at history from an ethnic background, and what you will write will not be fair assessment of the issue. So yes, that exists. That exists. But that is why you should define your the topic, the areas that you are going to look at, and then sometimes you have even an idea of the conclusion but is the conclusion supported by the facts? That is what generally in history people are looking at. These facts that do they support the conclusion? The conclusion is personal. My senior brother used to tell me that when you are walking on the street, you see two chickens fighting. One has a color red, the other has a color blue. All of a sudden, you are urging the one with blue color, no, beat it, come on, go on. And he said, he hasn't eaten your corn. Why is it that you are prejudiced against the one in red color? It's because you love red color. You like everything red, but you don't like anything blue. So these prejudices are there. But a good historian should be able to suppress the prejudices and give a personal opinion. As I said, if you give this Nkrumah did this, you give all the things Nkrumah did, good things he did. Then you did all the bad things he did. And you say, in my opinion, this is my conclusion. Somebody said, but they will respect you because you have recognized all the potential facts. But if you suppress some of the facts because you want to reach a certain conclusion, then I think that is wrong.
Well, thank you very much. I know we would want to ask some more questions, but our time is up. We need to take a break and return in some 15 minutes to take our second presentation. On your behalf, I want to say thank you very much to Professor Addo Fening for sharing these insightful thoughts with us. It will certainly inform, I'm sure, many of the things we'll do moving forward. Those of us who don't keep diaries, I think you should probably start doing that and be thinking also about someday writing your autobiography or keeping enough information to enable somebody to write about you. Thank you very much. Once again, let me warmly welcome many people who have joined us from far and near. Dr. Maureen from Nigeria, Jeremiah, who will be presenting later. I see Dr. Mujambi from Kenya. Of course, Professor Howell was with us from Australia. Ernest, who is cooling off in the US and all of that. Thank you all for joining in. And Jonas also from the UK and Obli. So all over the world, and we are glad you are able to participate. And myself from Cameroon. Wonderful to see all of you, and we'll continue in another 3 minutes. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for having me. Thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Okay, we'll reconvene in 15 minutes to take our second presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Mugambi, are you there?